When did you start to get a sense of what was going to happen with the game itself?
Once they told the teams to go inside and they had not yet postponed it, at that point they had suspended it, you could see the reaction from the players that this was not a team equipped emotionally to go back on a field and play a football game within a few minutes. And to kind of give you an idea what was happening, as the players walked back into the tunnel, Dan, towards their locker room, they could still see the ambulance that was waiting in the parking lot because they were waiting for DeMar's mother to make it down from the stands to ride with him to the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. So they could still see the ambulance he was in at the end of the tunnel before it left. And you could just tell from the looks on the faces and the emotion from the players, they were not going to play this game. Within a matter of minutes, Zach Taylor, the Bengals head coach, came over to their locker room to meet with Sean McDermott. The referees were there, and we had a good clue then that there was no way they were playing this game at that point.
Did you have any idea that who was making this decision? Because there's conflicting reports of the teams were told you got 5 minutes. Joe Buck said this, I think, 4 times on the broadcast. The NFL, Troy Vincent said, no, that was not the case. I didn't know what role the coaches, the captains played in this. Can you sort any of that out for us?
As far as what the NFL and their involvement, I can't. I can tell you the referees, Zach Taylor, Sean McDermott, and members of the front office for the Buffalo Bills were outside of the Bills locker room discussing this pretty quickly after the announcement of the suspension of the game. So to me, that was a signal that they were there amongst each other talking about this. Sean McDermott didn't last long in that meeting. He was out there very briefly, and then he went back inside the locker room to be with his team. But Zach Taylor, other members of the Bengals coaching staff were there with the referees discussing, obviously, deciding to postpone this game. But as far as the NFL's involvement in it, from where I was and my vantage point, I don't know how much involvement they had at that point.
How much confusion was going on?
Not much, quite honestly,
Okay.
because there was, to me, the confusion was why was the ambulance still in the parking lot? Look, we had the player on the field for 9 minutes with the chest compressions and the AED and the players having to watch this. And a lot of times, Dan, you'll see guys go up to a player as they're leaving a field or being lifted into an ambulance or lifted up onto a stretcher, go up there and tap him and dap him up and make sure he's okay. And they know they have his support. Those guys were told to stay back. So that was different right there. But once they'd announced it, that the suspension of the game was going to happen, it was very organized. The guys went back into the locker room. Both teams stayed in their locker rooms for a long time. It wasn't until they announced the actual postponement of the game that we saw some of the Bengals players then make their way from the Bengals locker room down to the Bills locker room. That included team captains. That included Joe Burrow, who made his way to the Bills locker room. In fact, we saw Josh Allen then go to the Bengals locker room as well to meet with some of their players, because the Bills stayed in Cincinnati at Paycor Stadium for a long time. I mean, this happened in the 9 o'clock hour. They didn't leave. The buses didn't leave the stadium until 12:30. So those guys were there for a long time just to be around each other, to comfort each other in any way they could. And I think you see this fraternity of football players, right? Where, look, I'm sure there are Bengals players who played with him at some point, played against him or with him at some point in the pre-draft process. So I'm sure a lot of guys in the Bengals locker room knew him. Not only the Bills were feeling this, but the Bengals players as well.